empire without a capital. A ruler without a permanent army. No single treasury, no uniform bureaucracy, no fixed border that stayed fixed for long. By the logic of the modern state, the Holy Roman Empire looks less like an empire than a contradiction that somehow learned to survive. And to intimidate everyone around it. Its survival stretched from the imperial coronation of Otto the First in AD 962 to the surrender of the crown in AD 1806. Nearly 1,000 years. Not because it resembled France or England or any later centralized power, but because it operated by different rules altogether. Professor Adrian Lockwell here, and this is Archives of Humanity, where history is treated not as a procession of crowned heads, but as a contest over the most difficult problem in politics. How authority holds together when no one possesses enough force to command everything directly. For centuries, the empire has been ridiculed with Voltaire's elegant insult. Neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. The phrase survives because it is sharp, and because it flatters the modern instinct to laugh at anything that does not resemble the nation-state. But Voltaire was making a polemical judgment in the Age of Enlightenment, not offering a constitutional analysis. The difference matters. Peter H. Wilson in the Holy Roman Empire, 1,000 Years of Europe, and Joachim Whaley in Germany and the Holy Roman Empire reveals something far more unsettling than a failed curiosity. The empire endured because it was built to assemble power, not merely to issue commands. It was a political order that understood a brutal truth. In a fractured landscape, rule does not always flow downward from a throne. Sometimes it must be negotiated upward from princes, bishops, cities, and the stubborn realities of local power. The emperor ruled through hereditary lands, religious legitimacy, feudal bonds, judicial authority, patronage, and the slow grinding labor of cooperation. Authority moved through electors, territorial princes, bishops, abbots, counts, imperial knights, and free imperial cities. The empire was not an empty map with a single hand resting over it. It was a crowded chessboard, and every piece possessed leverage. Barbara Stolberg-Reilinger's work makes the point with particular force. Ritual, symbolism, rank, and public performance were not decorative leftovers from a primitive age. They were operational mechanisms. Seating arrangements, titles, ceremonies, precedents, and legal forms were part of how politics became legible and enforceable in a world where coercion alone could not do the job. Its territory changed repeatedly across the centuries, reaching at different moments into much of present-day Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, the Low Countries, northern Italy, Slovenia, and neighboring regions. That alone should prevent any easy label. This was rarely a unitary military superpower. It could be slow, divided, and infuriatingly legalistic. But it was also a geopolitical center of gravity whose dynasties, institutions, wealth, and cities shaped continental outcomes again and again. And here lies the central paradox. The empire's weakness and its resilience were not opposite qualities. They came from the same structure. A modern state is designed to push orders downward. The empire was designed, imperfectly and over centuries, to generate consent across overlapping jurisdictions. That made it harder to reform, harder to defend, and easier for privilege to harden into custom. But it also made total domination much more difficult. Its very complexity restrained tyranny even as it preserved inequality. So the real mystery is not why this empire looked messy. The real mystery is why that mess survived so long, and why Europe kept returning to it as a central stage of power. The answer does not begin in a throne room. It begins in the ruins of the Carolingian world, where legitimacy collapsed, borders blurred, and a new center of authority had to be improvised from chaos. The Carolingian world did not collapse in one dramatic ruin. It broke apart under pressure, then hardened into regional power centers that still carried the language of empire without possessing its unity. When the Treaty of Verdun in 843 divided Charlemagne's inheritance among his grandsons, it did not create modern nations. It carved the old Carolingian order into unstable zones of ambition, each one burdened with memories of shared rule and the practical reality of local power. The center had splintered, but authority did not disappear. It migrated toward whoever could still ride out, negotiate with magnates, and defend a population that had no interest in philosophical unity when survival was at stake. In the East, that meant a realm built around powerful duchies rather than a single obedient political machine. Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and Lotharingia were not ornamental divisions on a map. They were armed societies with their own elites, their own rivalries, and their own claim to govern. Timothy Reuter's work on the early Middle Ages makes clear how limited royal command really was in this world. Carl Leeser's scholarship goes even deeper into the aristocratic logic of the age. Kings ruled by binding magnates to themselves, not by sweeping them aside. The crown could not simply abolish these regional powers, because those powers were the very instruments through which the realm defended itself, collected loyalty, and survived the collapse of older imperial certainties. And the pressure was immediate. Magyar raids tore through the east, Slavic frontiers remained unstable, Viking violence still threatened the north, and noble rivalry turned succession into a contest over who could hold the realm together without provoking open fragmentation. In such a climate, the most effective ruler was not the one with the grandest theory of government. It was the one who could make defense compatible with aristocratic pride. Henry the Fowler understood that brutal arithmetic. He strengthened Saxon royal power not by pretending the dukes were irrelevant, but by turning them into partners in a system that could still produce security. That was the hidden craft of rulership in this age. Enough coercion to command respect, enough bargaining to prevent revolt, and enough shared interest to keep the realm from dissolving into feudal warfare. Otto the First inherited that foundation and transformed it into something far more consequential. At the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, he crushed the Magyar threat in a victory that mattered far beyond the battlefield itself. Medieval warfare was never only about bodies and blood. A triumph over raiders could become a sign of divine favor, a proof that the ruler had been chosen to defend Christian order, and a weapon against rival nobles who might otherwise dismiss the king as merely first among equals. Lechfeld gave Otto more than security. It gave him prestige that could be converted into authority, the rare kind of authority that made princes reconsider where loyalty should be placed. But military success did not yet equal empire. Victory had to be carried into the language of sacred legitimacy, and that meant Rome. In 962, Pope John XII crowned Otto emperor in the city that still carried the memory of Caesar, apostles, and universal rule. The act linked German kingship, Italian politics, papal authority, and the prestige of antiquity into one charged moment. It was dazzling precisely because it was unstable. Italy promised honor, influence, and the aura of Roman inheritance, but it also pulled the ruler across the Alps and away from the political core that still needed attention. Every imperial journey south carried a strategic price north of the mountains. Every claim to universality risked weakening the very base that made the claim possible. Otto's dependence on bishops and abbots was part of that strategy. Ecclesiastical lords could administer lands, preserve order, and serve the crown without founding hereditary dynasties in the same way secular princes did. That made them ideal counterweights to the great ducal families. The so-called Ottonian church system was not a perfect constitutional design waiting to be admired from a distance. It was a practical response to a dangerous world, a way of turning sacred office into political infrastructure. Bishops could be moved, rewarded, and relied upon in ways that hereditary magnates often could not. Yet the deeper historical question remains unresolved even here. Historians still debate whether 962 should be treated as a clean foundation date at all, and the later term Holy Roman Empire must not be projected backward too neatly, as if a finished institution simply arrived on the scene. What emerged under the Ottonians was stranger than a nation-state and more fragile than a fantasy of unified empire. It was a restoration born from insecurity, a universal claim built on negotiation, and a kingship that reached for Roman Christian legitimacy while remaining trapped inside the politics of regional power. That tension would shape everything that followed, because once rulers claimed sacred imperial authority, a rival universal institution had to decide whether emperors were protectors of the church or masters of it. Ottonian and Salian kings had long relied on bishops because bishops were far more than shepherds of souls. They were landlords, judges, royal counselors, and imperial princes, and because they were bound by celibacy, their power could be borrowed without easily becoming hereditary. A king could place a ring and a staff in loyal hands and, at least in theory, gain piety, administration, and obedience in one stroke. But the very usefulness of that arrangement contained the seed of crisis. The ruler who controlled sacred appointment could begin to look less like a defender of the church than its proprietor. That accusation entered Latin Christendom with the force of a weapon when Pope Gregory VII launched his reform program. This was not a minor clerical tidy-up. It was an attempt to rescue the church from lay domination, to crush simony, to enforce clerical celibacy, and to declare that spiritual office could no longer be distributed like a royal favor. In the judgment of H.E.J. Cowdery, Gregory was no mere moral preacher drifting through history. He was a pope with a formidable instinct for institutional power, a man who understood that reform could become a new basis of sovereignty. Gerd Tellenbach, approaching the conflict from another angle, saw something even larger. A church claiming autonomy inside a feudal world built on dependence, obligation, and hierarchy. The battle was never only about who could appoint a bishop. It was about whether the highest authority in Christendom came from blood, office, or sacrament. Henry IV entered that struggle already exposed. German princes, never fully comfortable with a king who might harden royal prerogative into something closer to monarchy, understood immediately that papal condemnation could be turned into political leverage. Once Gregory excommunicated Henry, the sentence did not merely wound his conscience. It loosened the bonds of obedience. In a world where legitimacy was sacred, excommunication was not just spiritual punishment. It was political solvent. It told rebels that resistance could be recast as righteousness. The princes who opposed Henry did not need to invent a new justification for revolt. The Pope supplied it. And yet the famous scene at Canossa was never as simple as a defeated emperor begging mercy from an all-powerful pope. In AD 1077, Henry crossed the Alps and performed penance before Gregory. The image became immortal because it condensed humiliation into a single emblem. But historical theater often hides strategic arithmetic. Henry's submission also stripped his German enemies of the one sacred argument they needed to depose him. Once absolution was granted, the coalition assembled against him lost the moral banner under which it had gathered, even if the political war continued untouched. Public penance, in this case, was also a tactical reset. That is why Canossa should be read not as an ending, but as a reversal inside a longer contest. Gregory won immense prestige. The papacy emerged stronger, more disciplined, and more capable of challenging kings on the ground of principle. Yet Henry did not disappear into disgrace. He recovered, fought his German enemies with renewed ferocity, backed an antipope, and eventually forced Gregory out of Rome. The meaning of the episode changed depending on where the observer stood. To later papal memory, Canossa looked like submission. To Henry's political survival, it was a maneuver that bought time and fracture. Medieval rule was often like that. Symbolic defeat and practical recovery could inhabit the same reign. The Concordat of Worms in AD 1122 did not heal the conflict so much as fence it in. Spiritual office and temporal authority were distinguished in principle, but never so cleanly that the old overlap disappeared. Bishops would still matter as both churchmen and territorial powers, yet now the West had been forced into a more dangerous and more durable condition. Rival institutions capable of denying each other total supremacy. The settlement was born not from harmony, but from exhaustion, and from the discovery that even submission could be a maneuver when legitimacy itself had become the battlefield. The papal triumph over investiture did not end imperial ambition. It forced that ambition to change costumes. Once bishops could no longer be handled like obedient royal officials, the Hohenstaufen emperors turned toward a broader and more dangerous vision. Not domination of the church, but mastery of the arteries that linked Germany to the richest parts of Latin Christendom. Roads, tolls, courts, ports, tribute, and legal authority became the real prizes. And in that contest, northern Italy mattered more than any forested duchy beyond the Alps. Frederick Barbarossa understood the attraction with brutal clarity. The communes of Lombardy were not provincial backwaters. They were dense centers of commerce, legal learning, and municipal wealth, places where money moved quickly and political autonomy had already hardened into habit. For an emperor searching for universal rule, they looked like the perfect target and the perfect temptation. But the very things that made them valuable also made them dangerous. To assert imperial rights, there was not merely to collect revenue. It was to challenge a whole civic civilization that had learned how to defend itself. At Roncaglia in AD 1158, Barbarossa tried to give force to his claims through Roman law. The regalia, those imperial rights tied to roads, markets, tolls, and justice, were presented not as inventions of royal greed, but as ancient powers belonging to the crown. That legal language mattered. It turned conquest into jurisprudence, and naked extraction into a theory of sovereignty. Yet the communes heard something very different. They heard a distant monarch trying to turn municipal freedom into taxable property. They heard an empire that did not want merely loyalty, but access to their wealth, their walls, and their internal life. That fear fused rival cities into the Lombard League. Urban competitors who normally guarded their independence with suspicion suddenly discovered that cooperation was the only language capable of answering imperial pressure. Papal support gave the League legitimacy, but the deeper force was strategic self-preservation. Barbarossa's campaign had triggered one of the oldest rules of politics. The more a ruler appears capable of absolute power, the faster others learn to unite against him. Imperial strength did not simply command obedience. It generated counterpower. The defeat at Legnano in AD 1176 made that lesson impossible to ignore. Barbarossa's forces did not just lose a battle. They collided with the limits of projection. Distance, terrain, urban militias, and coalition warfare exposed the weakness hidden inside imperial grandeur. The emperor could cross the Alps, but he could not make Italian cities disappear. The Peace of Constance in AD 1183 accepted that reality. It preserved imperial claims in theory while recognizing extensive communal liberties in practice. The crown survived, but only by conceding much of what it had tried to recover. That was not glorious victory. It was accommodation under pressure, and every such accommodation revealed how expensive universal monarchy really was. Frederick II inherited this paradox and deepened it. Through Sicily, he possessed something extraordinary. A wealthy kingdom with stronger administration than most rulers of his age could dream of, a court skilled in law and language, and revenues that gave his monarchy a sharper edge than the old German kings had enjoyed. Yet this advantage became a strategic trap. Place Sicily beside the imperial title, and the Papal States no longer looked protected by distance. They looked threatened by geometry. Encirclement was not a metaphor to the papacy. It was a map. Frederick answered with brilliance. He negotiated, legislated, bargained, and maneuvered with a sophistication that made many contemporaries see genius and menace at once. His recovery of Jerusalem during the Sixth Crusade proved that diplomacy could succeed where crusading zeal often failed, but it also made him more alarming, not less. A ruler who could achieve what others could not was a ruler who seemed fit for universal command. That was precisely why so many papal voices cast him as a danger to Christendom. Apocalyptic language was not a side effect of the conflict. It was one of its weapons. But brilliance did not repeal geography. Every move Frederick made in Italy demanded concessions in Germany, money from Sicily, and loyalty that could never be assumed for long. Every apparent expansion widened the circle of enemies. When Hohenstaufen power finally broke in the 13th century AD, the empire did not vanish into nothingness. It entered the Great Interregnum, and absence itself became a political force. Territorial princes, bishops, and local rulers hardened privileges they had once only negotiated. The crown had reached for universal monarchy. What it left behind was a harder, more cautious imperial world, one in which weakness was slowly turned into constitutional habit. After the collapse of Hohenstaufen universalism and the long haze of the interregnum, the German kingdom did not suddenly become stronger. It became negotiable. That was the real breakthrough. In AD 1356, Emperor Charles IV turned a dangerous ambiguity into procedure with the Golden Bull, the most famous constitutional act of the medieval empire. It did not create harmony. It did something more durable. It made competition legible. The election of a king had always been the empire's most vulnerable moment. A vacant throne could invite papal interference, princely rivalry, armed intimidation, and the slow poison of disputed legitimacy. The Golden Bull answered that problem by fixing the electoral roll of 7 prince-electors, 3 ecclesiastical princes and 4 secular rulers, each with clearly defined rank, rights, and ceremonial precedence. This was not democracy in any meaningful sense. It was an oligarchic settlement, a formalization of aristocratic privilege. But within that narrow and unequal framework, it reduced the chance that every succession would become a civil war wearing a sacred mask. As Barbara Stolberg-Reilinger has shown, ritual was never merely decorative in this world. It was constitutional machinery. Seating, titles, order of appearance, and precedence were not theatrical ornaments. They were political facts made visible. The deeper innovation was that imperial power no longer depended on a fantasy of direct command. The empire functioned through estates, not equal subjects. An imperial estate was not simply a lord with land. It was a legally recognized corporate authority embedded in the imperial order, often with immediacy, meaning it answered directly to the emperor rather than through an intermediate prince. That distinction mattered enormously. A free imperial city guarded its walls, taxes, market rights, and legal immunities with fierce determination because those privileges were not local decorations. They were the city's political armor. Benjamin Arnold's work on territorial lordship makes clear that these actors were not passive provinces waiting to be absorbed. They were power centers with memory, ambition, and legal personality, fully aware that status itself was a form of power. In practice, the imperial diet became the great chamber in which this world argued with itself. Electors, princes, bishops, abbots, and cities gathered there to bargain over taxation, defense, legislation, and later religious policy. The emperor presided, but rarely in the manner of a modern sovereign issuing commands downward. More often he arbitrated among overlapping rights, inherited privileges, and competing precedents. That is why Peter Moraw's scholarship on the late medieval empire matters so much. The Constitution was not a single document descending from a founding moment. It was an accumulated order of charters, exemptions, court decisions, electoral understandings, and rituals that had to be constantly performed in order to remain real. In an empire like this, law was not the opposite of power. Law was one of power's principal languages. The legal institutions deepened that logic. The Imperial Chamber Court and the Aulic Council offered arenas where conflict could be pulled away from violence and into procedure. Their delays were famous and often infuriating. But delay was also a political technology. It bought time, cooled tempers, and forced rival powers to seek allies, arguments, and settlements instead of immediately reaching for the sword. Around AD 1500, the imperial circles extended that same principle into regional governance, helping with defense, taxation, policing, and the execution of imperial decisions. Landfrieden, the public peace, tried to suppress the old world of private warfare and replace it with a legal order in which even the mighty had to justify their quarrels before a broader system. That was the secret hidden inside the empire's apparent disorder. Its bewildering complexity was not random decay. It was an evolving technology for managing rival power centers without pretending that rivalry could be abolished. Charles IV had not solved the contradiction between monarchy and plurality. He had made that contradiction survivable. And once survival acquired a constitution, the next great dynasties would learn to dominate the system from within. What made this dynasty so dangerous was not a single great conquest, but the patient conversion of family strategy into political geography. The Habsburgs expanded through marriage, inheritance, strategic electioneering, and selective warfare, a colder and often more durable method than battlefield glory. Maximilian I's marriage to Mary of Burgundy tied the house to one of the richest prize fields in Europe, bringing the Low Countries courtly prestige and a financial base that no Austrian sword could have carved out alone. Then came the quieter detonations of later unions. Claims in Spain, Bohemia, and Hungary, each one opened by a wedding contract and each one capable of closing only through war. The Habsburgs understood that legitimacy could accumulate faster than armies could march, but they also inherited the obligations, enemies, and rival claims that always followed legitimacy into the room. Charles V inherited not a kingdom, but a strategic maze. Spain, the Low Countries, the Austrian lands, possessions in Italy, and the first great wave of overseas expansion converged on a single man whose title sounded more coherent than his actual power. In later memory, this became the empire on which the sun never set. In reality, that phrase hides the friction that mattered most: distance, delay, credit, and constitutional resistance. Charles could possess a territory on parchment and still fail to command its taxes, its nobles, or its soldiers when crisis arrived. Geoffrey Parker, in Emperor, A New Life of Charles V, captured the exhausting scale of that burden, while Thomas A. Brady Jr. showed how imperial politics remained entangled with cities, estates, confessions, and local privileges that no emperor could simply erase. Even the imperial crown itself had to be won inside a financial market. In 1519, Charles secured election as emperor after an expensive contest against Francis I of France, with Fugger credit greasing the machinery of persuasion. That detail is not decorative. It reveals that money was not merely supporting power. It was becoming one of power's operating systems. The bankers of Augsburg did more than lend. They turned dynastic ambition into immediate liquidity, and in doing so they exposed the emperor to the logic of creditors. A ruler who depends on financiers must bargain with them, and a ruler who must bargain with them is no longer fully sovereign in the older martial sense. Around Charles moved a dense web of intelligence: Venetian observers, papal informants, French agents, Ottoman dispatches, resident ambassadors, intercepted correspondence, and confessional networks that carried rumor as if it were artillery. Europe was becoming a continent of listening posts. Then the fronts multiplied. France pressed from one side. The Ottoman Empire pressed from another. Protestant unrest spread through the empire. Papal suspicion hardened in Italy. Fiscal strain appeared everywhere. Revolts broke out in Spain. Unrest simmered in the Low Countries, and money, paper, and coercive force had to be moved across regions that did not naturally cooperate. Charles possessed extraordinary resources, but they were not one resource. They were separate inheritances, each with its own laws, taxes, elites, and political memory. That is why the Habsburg achievement was so impressive and so fragile at the same time. The house had gathered more power than imperial institutions could fully integrate, and the geometry of that inheritance was merciless. Mohacs in 1526 made the problem even sharper. The Ottoman victory destroyed the independent Hungarian monarchy and transformed the Danube frontier into a central theater of Habsburg-Ottoman rivalry. Then, 1 year later, the sack of Rome by mutinous imperial troops exposed the darkest truth of all. Armies financed badly can become political actors in their own right. An empire that cannot pay its soldiers may discover that its soldiers are the most dangerous creditors of all. Some historians have treated Charles as the exhausted universal monarch crushed by a world too large for one soul. Others emphasize the structural contradiction of composite monarchy. Too many pieces had been gathered before any machinery existed to fuse them. Both views contain truth. Charles was formidable, but he could command a horizon without uniformly commanding the lands beneath it. And as imperial authority stretched from Burgundy to Spain and into Italy, A theological revolt in Saxony was already preparing to turn this overextended political order into a struggle over salvation itself. Charles had inherited a religious order that still believed hierarchy could contain every fracture from above. That illusion broke first in Saxony, where Martin Luther's attack on indulgences in AD 1517 began as a dispute over repentance and clerical abuse, but very quickly escaped the narrow world of the university. Once the argument entered print, it stopped behaving like an academic quarrel and started behaving like a contagion of authority. A thesis could be debated in private. A pamphlet could be copied, translated, illustrated, and sold into cities that had never heard Luther's voice. Printers, woodcuts, preachers, and readers formed a new political ecology, and the old guardians of orthodoxy were forced to watch a local controversy turn into a trans-regional crisis almost before they understood what had happened. The first strategic fact of the Reformation was not simply theology. It was velocity. Lyndall Roper has shown how much force Luther drew from the intensity of conscience and the severity of his religious imagination. Yet conscience alone does not change history. It becomes decisive only when other powers discover that it can be used. Territorial rulers saw room to defend autonomy against distant judgment. City councils saw a chance to regulate belief inside their walls. Humanists sensed a reforming opening. Ordinary believers heard language that made salvation feel immediate, direct, and terrifyingly personal. What had begun as an attack on the commercialization of grace quickly became an argument over who could define truth at all. And once that question was asked in public, every institution that claimed to speak for Christian order had to answer it or lose credibility. At the Diet of Worms in AD 1521, that conflict entered the imperial stage. Luther stood before emperor, princes, and churchmen, and refused to recant unless convinced by scripture and reason. The famous scene has often been flattened into a moral portrait of one man's courage, but the deeper significance lay elsewhere. Charles V could issue the Edict of Worms, yet paper decrees did not move men by themselves. They depended on princes, magistrates, and local officers who controlled roads, prisons, printing houses, and markets. In an empire built on negotiated authority, the emperor's command traveled through layers of power that could slow it, reshape it, or quietly refuse it. Frederick the Wise did more than shelter a troublesome reformer. He demonstrated that territorial power could interrupt imperial judgment and create a sanctuary where a condemned idea could survive. That weakness turned the imperial ban into a test of the empire's real structure. On parchment, unity still seemed possible. In practice, enforcement was fragmented by jurisdiction, delayed by politics, and often sabotaged by those who had no interest in helping Charles enforce a religious settlement that might strengthen a rival. Suppression even carried a dangerous irony. Censorship could give a text more prestige, and seizure could turn resistance into a sign of moral seriousness. Belief had become geopolitics. The old claim that doctrine could be sealed off from political life had collapsed, because institutions were now divided over which truth deserved coercion. That division widened brutally during the German Peasants' War in AD 1524 and AD 1525. Religious language spilled into a social world already burdened by dues, labor obligations, and seigneurial pressure. Villagers and laborers did not merely echo Luther. They fused reforming rhetoric with demands against old inequalities. The result horrified both Protestant princes and Catholic lords, because it suggested that theological correction might also become social demolition. Luther recoiled from the revolt, and that recoil mattered. It reassured rulers that the movement could be disciplined from above rather than turned against every form of authority. Reform could be protected, but only if it learned to bargain with power. From that bargain came armed confession. The Schmalkaldic League tied Protestant territories together for mutual defense, turning belief into a coalition structure. Charles finally broke that coalition at Mulberg in AD 1547, and for a moment imperial arms seemed to have restored order. But the victory was deceptive. An army had been defeated. The territorial shelters, doctrinal commitments, and political habits sustaining Protestantism had not been destroyed. Charles had won a battle, not the religious future of the empire. That distinction reveals the limits of force inside a constitutional world where legitimacy was distributed among many hands. As Heinz Schilling and Thomas A. Brady Jr. have argued, confessionalization worked when churches and territorial states cooperated in disciplining society. Yet the process was never neat, because local bargaining, uneven enforcement, and political hesitation kept the settlement unstable. The Peace of Augsburg in AD 1555 was therefore not the birth of religious freedom. It was a truce engineered by exhaustion. Lutheranism gained legal recognition, but Calvinists remained outside the formal bargain. Dissenters still faced pressure or exile, and ecclesiastical territories remained contested ground. The crucial principle was brutally pragmatic. The ruler of a territory would determine its authorized confession, within limits that left the deeper contradictions intact. Augsburg postponed catastrophe, but it did not resolve the imperial question. It merely pushed the unresolved struggle eastward, where Bohemia would become the next furnace for imperial weakness. The Peace of Augsburg had not solved the problem of religious coexistence. It had merely frozen the conflict and handed decisive authority to the territorial princes. For a generation, exhaustion could pass for stability. Then Bohemia exposed the truth that unresolved constitutional ambiguity is not peace at all. In Prague, in 1618, Protestant nobles confronted imperial officials over church rights, local liberties, and the growing fear that Habsburg recovery would harden into permanent domination. The defenestration of Prague was more than a dramatic insult thrown from a castle window. It was a public declaration that trust inside the imperial order had collapsed. And once trust dies in a composite monarchy, law itself begins to look like occupation. Bohemia's revolt quickly became a test of legitimacy. The crown was offered to Frederick V of the Palatinate, a prince who accepted a throne with enormous symbolic value and far too little military depth. That choice fused confession to dynastic ambition and made compromise look like betrayal on every side. At first, the crisis still appeared containable, a regional rebellion that might be isolated and punished. But coalition logic does what local authority cannot. Once the Imperial and Catholic League forces crushed the rebels at White Mountain in 1620, the victory no longer looked like restoration. It looked like a warning. A rebellion had been defeated, and now every prince had to ask whether imperial power would remain bounded or become a machinery for permanent reconstruction under Habsburg control. That fear was intensified by Emperor Ferdinand II's Edict of Restitution in 1629. The decree attempted to recover vast tracts of Catholic ecclesiastical property and convert a battlefield advantage into a constitutional settlement. This was the fatal error of the war's early imperial phase. The moment military momentum was mistaken for consent. To Ferdinand's supporters, the edict could appear as justice delayed at last. To many others, even some who feared Protestant radicalism, it signaled a monarchy trying to turn temporary success into irreversible domination. Peter H. Wilson treats this not as fate unfolding by itself, but as a chain of decisions made under pressure. Jeffrey Parker's wider 17th century framework adds another layer, showing how war, fiscal strain, climatic stress, and administrative weakness could reinforce one another. Yet the imperial estates were never passive scenery. They delayed, bargained, defected, financed, and sometimes invited the storm when it seemed the lesser danger. The war widened because every outside power saw opportunity inside the chaos. Denmark entered. Then Sweden, under Gustavus Adolphus, arrived in 1630 with disciplined armies, Protestant prestige, and a commander whose victories briefly altered the balance of fear. Swedish success at Breitenfeld shattered the assumption that the Habsburg war machine was unstoppable. But even that triumph did not bring resolution. War rarely ends where victory is first announced. Gustavus fell at Lutzen in 1632, and his death converted momentum into uncertainty once again. The battlefield had not produced a final answer. It had produced another opening. Into that opening stepped Wallenstein, the great military entrepreneur of the age. He assembled armies through patronage, contributions, contracts, and personal allegiance, solving the emperor's mobilization problem while creating a power center of his own. His genius lay in making war self-financing through occupation and extraction, but that same system blurred the line between supply and organized predation. Reports from the field were unreliable. Diplomatic assurances were often written in one register and meant in another, and rulers learned to speak publicly of confessional loyalty while negotiating advantage in secret. When Wallenstein began to drift into independent diplomacy, his usefulness and his danger became indistinguishable. He was assassinated in 1634 with imperial approval. A grim admission that a commander who becomes too capable can look more threatening than the enemy. Then Catholic France entered openly against the Catholic Habsburgs in 1635, and the war shed the last illusion that doctrine alone explained anything. Raison d'etat had become the stronger creed. France preferred strategic encirclement of the Habsburgs to confessional consistency, and that choice exposed the raw arithmetic beneath the rhetoric. The war now consumed Central Europe through requisition, disease, displacement, fiscal extraction, and the slow collapse of local order. Some regions were devastated far more than others. The losses were uneven, regional, and shaped by occupation routes, supply systems, and the movement of armies rather than by any single uniform pattern. That uneven destruction is part of the deeper lesson. The 30 Years' War was not simply a catastrophe of belief. It was a catastrophe of coalition politics, where every attempt to impose certainty widened the circle of fear and made the next compromise look like surrender. By the time the diplomats assembled, the war had already stripped away the illusion that any great power could force a clean ending without unleashing a wider ruin. So the Congress divided itself in two. Catholic and Protestant protocol, rank, and ceremonial precedents made a single gathering almost unworkable, and the negotiations split between Münster and Osnabrück. That separation was not a mere inconvenience of logistics. It was a confession, written into the geography of diplomacy, that Europe still lived inside a fractured order in which even proximity carried confessional danger. Couriers moved drafts across the distances. Mediators translated not only language but suspicion. Seating, titles, access, and order of audience were not decorative details. They were the language through which power acknowledged, denied, or preserved status. Derek Croxton's work on Westphalia makes clear that peacemaking was never simply about stopping armies. It was about deciding who could speak as an equal and who would be reduced to silence. The fighting did not wait politely for the ink to dry. Armies continued to maneuver while clauses were argued, guarantees revised, and formulas tested for what they revealed about victory and humiliation. The treaties of 1648 adjusted territorial claims, recognized political realities that no battlefield had fully erased, and confirmed legal protections for Catholic, Lutheran, and Reformed estates. The benchmark year of 1624 was used for many disputed ecclesiastical possessions, not because that year possessed mystical authority, but because law required a fixed point beyond which every conquest could not automatically become permanent right. That choice mattered. It told the belligerents that war could alter possession, yet politics would still judge which changes could survive peace. Confession was not removed from public life. It was absorbed into a constitutional settlement that accepted religious division as a fact that had to be governed rather than annihilated. The order that emerged was not neutral. It was durable. And here the familiar myth begins to collapse. Westphalia did not summon the modern sovereign state into existence in a single revolutionary stroke. Andreas Oeschender's critique is devastating precisely because it exposes how anachronistic that story can be. The peace did not invent sovereignty. It formalized layered authority inside an older imperial and European world already built from rights, privileges, jurisdictions, and negotiated obligations. Imperial estates retained extensive powers. They continued to participate in imperial institutions, govern their internal affairs, and conduct foreign relations within limits, provided those alliances were not directed against the emperor or the empire. France and Sweden gained influence, guarantees, and strategic advantages, but the Holy Roman Empire did not dissolve into a tidy map of fully independent nation-states. It remained a legal organism whose internal organs still functioned. That survival depended on a brutal political reality. Exhausted belligerents could agree only when no coalition could plausibly destroy the rest without provoking a new war in response. Peace became possible not because ambition vanished, but because total victory stopped looking affordable. Procedure outlasted ideological certainty. The older nationalist habit of treating the empire as a decayed relic collapses under the evidence of what followed. Peter H. Wilson and Joachim Whaley both show that imperial institutions retained real administrative and judicial force after 1648. The imperial diet, eventually assembled permanently at Regensburg from 1663, became the stage on which this negotiated order continued to operate. Imperial courts still heard disputes. Political life did not evaporate into absolutist simplicity. It moved into law, precedent, and endless bargaining. That was the deeper achievement of Westphalia. Not the birth of a brand new world, but the rescue of an old one from total collapse. The settlement weakened the dream of confessional uniformity without making religion irrelevant. It stabilized coexistence without pretending hostility had disappeared. It preserved the empire because the peace restored confidence that membership still offered protection, not only against imperial domination but also against predatory neighbors. In that uneasy arrangement, the post-war empire became the arena in which Austria and Prussia would later compete for mastery, each learning that power in Central Europe was never only about armies. It was also about the legal architecture that made survival possible when no side could afford annihilation. Westphalia had not frozen imperial politics into peace. It had only granted the empire a second, harder life. For more than a century after the treaties, the system endured because it still solved a problem that no rival solved better: how to hold dozens of unequal powers inside one legal order without turning every disagreement into annihilation. But the balance was never static. It was being hollowed out from above and below, as Austria and Prussia ceased to behave like ordinary imperial estates and began to act like states within the state. Austria's strength did not come only from the imperial crown. The Habsburg monarchy had spent generations building power on the Ottoman frontier, hardening its rule in Bohemia, absorbing Hungary, and accumulating a web of dynastic lands that stretched both inside and beyond the imperial framework. Vienna could still speak in the language of imperial guardianship, but that language increasingly concealed a more expansive reality. Austria was becoming a composite monarchy with its own strategic logic, its own military needs, and its own priorities. those priorities did not always match the needs of the empire as a whole. The emperor was still the emperor, but the monarchy behind the emperor was no longer simply imperial. Brandenburg Prussia moved in a very different direction. It pursued austerity, discipline, and militarization with unusual consistency, converting taxation into regiments and bureaucracy into battlefield readiness. That was the deeper meaning of Frederick the Great's seizure of Silesia in AD 1740. It was not only a territorial grab. It was a demonstration that the rising powers were now willing to test the imperial order by force whenever that order stood between them and strategic advantage. The empire's older habits of compromise still existed, but they were now being challenged by rulers who had learned to think in terms of speed, coercion, and permanent military readiness. The Austro-Prussian rivalry reached its first great continental test in the 7 Years' War, when Central Europe became entangled in a conflict that was global in scope and devastating in effect. Prussia survived, and survival in the logic of great power politics meant something even more important than battlefield success: credibility. It had proved that it could endure pressure from far stronger enemies. That altered the calculations of every smaller imperial territory. Many of them lacked the military scale to defend themselves against nearby giants, and for them imperial law still mattered. The empire remained a shield, however imperfect, against absorption. Joachim Whaley's Germany and the Holy Roman Empire is indispensable here, because it restores the empire as a functioning political arena rather than a decaying shell. Peter H. Wilson's Heart of Europe and the Holy Roman Empire reached the same conclusion with even greater force. This was not a dead body waiting for burial, but a living system under mounting strain. Tim Blanning's work on early modern Europe shows how dynastic competition, war finance, and elite bargaining kept reshaping power long after older historians had assumed the system had already failed. Then came the French Revolution, and the old imperial balance encountered a new species of politics. Revolution changed not just rulers but scale. It enlarged war, intensified legitimacy, and accelerated mobilization. Mass politics, ideological conflict, and territorial reorganization now moved with a force the imperial constitution had never been built to absorb. The Reichsdeputationsschluss of AD 1803 was the great fracture before the final rupture. Ecclesiastical territories were secularized, smaller polities were mediatized, and the map was violently simplified. Many princes accepted the rearrangement because survival suddenly seemed more urgent than principle. Others recognized the sharper truth: the imperial framework was no longer distributing security evenly. For the weak, it remained protection. For the strong, it increasingly looked like restraint. Napoleon then turned structural weakness into political collapse. In AD 1806, the Confederation of the Rhine drew major German princes out of the imperial system and into French protection. That was the decisive fact, more than any ceremonial symbolism. Once the leading members of the empire began bargaining with a conquering power outside its old legal horizon, the imperial center could no longer hold the whole structure together. Francis II understood the arithmetic of survival. On August 6, AD 1806, he relinquished the imperial crown. The empire did not die of old age. It lost the conditions that had made its peculiar order usable. And only then could the final verdict begin to emerge. The disappearance of the imperial crown in 1806 did not merely close an old legal order. It exposed a harder truth. For centuries, Central Europe had been held together not by perfect unity, but by the management of irreducible difference. Peter H. Wilson, Joachim Whaley, and Barbara Stolberg-Greilinger have all helped dismantle the old caricature of the empire as a historical embarrassment waiting for a cleaner successor. Their work makes the deeper pattern impossible to miss. This was a political organism that survived because it could absorb conflict, ritualize hierarchy, and convert rivalry into procedure. Older nationalist readings, and the once powerful Sonderweg interpretations, treated the empire as a failure waiting for Prussia or some later nation-state to finish the job. But that judgment confuses centralization with competence, and speed with strength. The empire was neither a modern nation-state nor a soft utopia. It was a hard, aristocratic, confessional system that understood something most empires learn too late. Power does not last simply by giving orders. It lasts by making competitors accept the same rules, even when they despise one another. Its rulers almost never possessed the kind of direct, uniform coercion that later states would consider normal. They negotiated with electors, bargained with princes, leaned on cities, relied on bishops, summoned diets, invoked law, and staged legitimacy in public with exquisite care. That could be maddeningly slow, could paralyze reform. It could preserve privilege long after privilege deserved to die. But the same structure also prevented many would-be conquerors from turning the whole political landscape into a single battlefield of annihilation. The empire did not eliminate conflict. It domesticated it. It gave territory, rank, confession, and custom enough legal dignity that rivals still had reasons to remain rivals instead of enemies for extinction. That is the strategic lesson hidden inside its long survival. Centralization offers concentration, speed, and command. Negotiated pluralism offers redundancy, local loyalty, and resilience when one center fails. Neither principle is morally pure. Neither is universally superior. Every political order has to decide which catastrophe it fears more: the chaos of too many veto points, or the tyranny of too much control. The Holy Roman Empire answered that question in the most costly way imaginable, by building an order that could endure precisely because it never fully solved the problem of division. Modern federations, multinational unions, alliance systems, and international courts still move inside that same ancient dilemma. They depend on members who often distrust one another, yet continue to cooperate because the alternative looks worse. Such systems frequently appear weak in ordinary bargaining and unexpectedly strong when the participants remember what collapse would invite. Institutions do not survive because every actor reveres them. They survive because enough actors conclude that the architecture of coexistence is still preferable to the wreckage beyond it. The Holy Roman Empire was not Europe's unfinished nation-state. It was Europe's longest experiment in ruling without absolute control. Its history reveals that power is not merely the capacity to command. Power is also the capacity to keep enemies inside a common order, to turn ambition into procedure, and to make survival more profitable than destruction. That is why the empire still matters, not as nostalgia, not as a hidden model of perfection, but as proof that political order can be built from restraint, bargaining, ceremony, law, and fear of the alternative. In that sense, the empire is less a relic than a warning. Every system that dreams only of obedience eventually collides with the limits of human ambition. Every system that learns how to contain ambition, however imperfectly, discovers a more durable kind of strength. Which mattered more inside the empire, force or negotiation? That question goes straight to the heart of its entire story. For more long-form historical analysis and deeper examinations of power, strategy, and institutions, subscribe to Archives of Humanity. And on the end screen, the next video continues this same level of historical insight.